Hello and welcome to the BusinessTalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Professor Hayley Blunden and Professor Mary Steffel to today's podcast episode. Both distinguished faculty members will offer their invaluable insights from their research on the topic how to delegate decision making strategically. Professor Hayley Blunden is an assistant professor of management at the Kogod School of Business, American University. Her research focuses on improving challenging workplace interactions, particularly in areas like advice, feedback, voice, and virtual work. Her work has been published in journals such as Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes and Journal of Experimental Psychology Journal, and featured in Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Economist, and more. Before academia, Professor Hayley worked in internal strategy, consulting, and finance with experience in organizations ranging from startups to Fortune 100 firms. Professor Hayley earned her Ph.D. in organizational behavior from Harvard University and MBA from Columbia Business School and a BA in economics and media studies from the University of Virginia. Our second distinguished guest for today's episode is Professor Mary Steffel. Professor Mary Steffel is an Associate Professor of Marketing and Joseph G. Reisman Research Professor at the DecisionMaking School of Business, Northeastern University. She is also affiliated with the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Professor Mary Steffel studies consumer judgment and decision making, focusing on when consumers seek help from others, make decisions for others, and how businesses and government can support better decision making. Her research has been published in top journals like Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes. She received the D'Amore Makim School of Business Teaching Excellence Award and was named one of Point and Cone's top 40 undergraduate professors. Professor Mary holds a PhD in marketing from the University of Florida, a PhD in psychology from Princeton University, and a BA in psychology from Columbia University. Professor Hayley and Professor Mary, it is a true honor and pleasure to have both of you on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to connect with you.
Professor Hayley and Professor Mary, can you explain the core idea behind your research on how to delegate decision making strategically and what inspired you to dwell so deeply into this topic?
So go ahead.
So the core idea of this research is that we show that delegating decision-making can actually come with an interpersonal cost. So those who are delegated decisions are actually, we find, less willing to help that delegator with future decisions or hire them, perceiving them actually as less fair. So, that's really the core idea. And maybe Mary can tell us some ways that, we also kind of go beyond this and find some ways that we can avoid this. I think we're going to unpack further, but do you want to kind of summarize that, Mary?
Yeah, absolutely. So we find that people can avoid this penalization by delegating strategically. So people can delegate decisions without seeming unfair if they delegate choices with positive outcomes, if they give employees responsibility for decisions that fall within their roles, and if they limit the potential consequences to other people, other colleagues. So one of the things that got me really interested in this topic was that I have been doing research on what I call the burden of choice, which finds that people who delegate decisions kind of expect to avoid the burdens associated with decision making, like regretting the decision that you've made if you think that, it wasn't the best possible decision, or feeling blame from other people if they're not happy with the decision that you've made. But I wondered whether these anticipated benefits might come with an interpersonal cost. And so to me, that's really what motivated me to connect with Hayley to look into this.
Yeah, no, it's one of the reasons, Mary has a lot of expertise in this area, and it was one of the reasons I was so excited to work with her on this idea. Because for me, I've been really interested in the interpersonal side of workplace decision-making. So often we focus on how do we make the best or most correct decision. But I want that to also take into consideration what that outcome is from an interpersonal perspective.
Professor Hayley, your research highlights the negative impact of delegating decision-making on delegator-delegate relationships. Can you elaborate on the challenges that arise when managers delegate choices to their employees?
Yeah, so Mary actually just raised some really important points. Often people hear that if you want to be effective in the workplace, you have to delegate, right? This is something we read constantly, it's in headlines. But our research highlights that you may want to zero in on the particular context of that delegation to assess its potential consequences, especially from an interpersonal standpoint. So one thing that Mary mentioned and is explored in her research prior to this is that potential burden of having decision responsibility. So what we found is that when people delegated decisions that might have a negative outcome or outside their roles or primarily affected others, those decision makers viewed the delegator as less fair and were less likely to help that delegator with future decisions. So this can actually represent a really significant cost in the workplace, because when you think about, who do we delegate to, who do we ask for help with our decisions at work, it's often the same colleagues over time. So if someone you often depend on for help is less willing to help you in the future, well, that can really, potentially handicap your effectiveness in the future. But I'll highlight that, importantly, we compared decision delegation, handing off decision responsibility, to advice seeking. And we didn't find similar interpersonal penalties for seeking advice. So, one way to potentially continue to have other people's input could be to, rather than delegate, ask them for advice.
Professor Mary, you discuss how delegating decision-making can lead to employee feeling overly burdened. What are some of the key factors that contribute to this feeling?
So there are several different factors that can make decision making feel more like a burden to people than a privilege, right? We think of having the ability to make decisions for oneself and other people as a privilege or even a right. But in many cases, having to shoulder the responsibility of making decisions for yourself or for others can feel like a burden, something that people would rather be without. So we find that one factor that increases the burden of a decision is decision difficulty. So when a decision feels more difficult, whether that be because the options are very similar in attractiveness, those options maybe involve trade-offs when you're making the decision, or maybe there's just a lot of options to sort through, such that decision becomes more difficult and gnarly to grapple with. We find that people start anticipating that they might regret if they were to make the wrong decision. And when they start feeling that sense of anticipated regret, they're more likely to want to delegate those decisions to somebody else, because they perceive that as enabling themselves to get the benefit of having a decision be made so that they can, enjoy the outcome of that decision, but without those costs of having to feel like you want to kick yourself later of like, oh, I wish I'd chosen something else. Another factor is whether you're making a decision just for yourself or for other people as well. In an organizational context, we're constantly making decisions that have implications beyond just ourselves, that are going to impact other employees, potential business partners, consumers. And so the more these decisions are going to affect others, the more people start worrying about the possible blame of making an unpopular decision. So especially if those choices might have potential downsides associated with them, or they might be something that, even if maybe not a bad decision, maybe isn't as attractive as other options people might be able to imagine, you could still feel like other people might point a finger at you and blame you for making a decision that they're unhappy with. And then beyond this, both of these types of decisions come with a greater burden of what I call responsibility. So people, they report feeling more responsible when they're making decisions for others, or they're more concerned about that burden of responsibility when those choices are difficult. And even that mere feeling of being responsible for these sorts of decisions can weigh heavier in these kinds of contexts. And so all of these things together often motivates people to seek out opportunities to delegate decisions to other people. We might even call it passing the buck, in order to avoid getting saddled with those negative consequences.
Thank you. Very insightful. Professor Hayley, what are some of the interpersonal consequences that delegators and delegates might experience when decision making is handed over? And how can this be mitigated?
Yeah, so one thing that our research highlights is that decision delegation can affect perceptions of fairness. So we found that people who were asked to make a decision rather than ask for advice on it perceived that requester as less fair. And this relates back to that burden of responsibility that Mary was just talking about, right? So it can be really aversive for people to take that on. And then downstream, as I kind of mentioned it when we talked about our core idea and our overview, this can impact people's willingness to give advice in the future and even hire the requester. So this burden of responsibility really invokes a negative response like this when that burden really kind of should fall on the requester's shoulders or on the delegator's shoulders. So we can think about mitigating it by changing the extent to which that burden is more likely to be the decision makers to bear. So what are situations in which actually that burden should maybe be passed to the person we're delegating to?
Let's talk about some solutions also. So this question is for both of you. In your paper, you propose research-based solutions for delegating decisions more fairly. Could you share a few key strategies that managers can use to delegate more effectively while maintaining healthy relationships?
Absolutely. So one thing people can do is can focus on delegating choices with positive rather than negative potential outcomes. So people tend to perceive delegated decisions to be more unfair when those choices or making those choices might affect them negatively. And making choices with potentially negative outcomes can open people up to getting blamed when other people are unhappy with those negative outcomes. In fact, we ran a study in which we looked at how people responded when they were delegated a decision about potential layoffs versus potential bonuses, right? So a negative outcome versus a positive outcome. And we found that they were less willing to help delegators again in the future when they were delegated those decisions about layoffs versus bonuses. And this was rooted in their perception that it was unfair of someone to burden them with a decision with negative outcomes. Another one is that we can give employees responsibility for decisions that fall within their roles. So people tend to perceive delegated decisions to be more unfair when the decision transfer seems inappropriate or illegitimate in some way. For example, when it falls outside of someone's purview. So in one of our studies, people who were delegated a decision about a new branch location for a bank, they thought that that decision transfer was fairer when their assigned role was responsible for real estate decisions than when it was not, when it related to employee benefits, something else entirely different.
Yeah, and the third way we actually found that we can make these decision delegation feel fair is actually when we can limit the potential consequences to other colleagues. So people perceive delegated decisions to be more unfair when the decision transfer primarily affects others than when it primarily affects the person being delegated to make that decision. So we actually ran a study in which people were considering a work from home schedule for either themselves or for their team, right? For their team's administrator. And people thought that that was much fairer to delegate that decision when it concerned the person that was being delegated to than when it concerned another colleague.
Professor Mary, how can managers assess when it's the right time to delegate decision making and when they should retain that responsibility to avoid potential negative consequences?
So our research suggests that focusing on fairness is a really good way to decide when to delegate and when to hold on to that responsibility. So when the decision outcome has a high potential to have negative consequences, is outside of the employee's scope of responsibility, or primarily affects other people, there are likely to be interpersonal costs associated with decision delegation, and managers looking to utilize their employees' knowledge should avoid delegating or ask for advice instead. And when these elements are reversed, transferring decision responsibility is less likely to be interpersonally costly and might even provide employees a better venue to test out their decision-making skills.
Professor Hayley, what role does trust play in the delegation process, and how can it impact the effectiveness of delegating decision making?
Yeah, so we know from prior work, really foundational work on delegation, that trust plays a really huge role in delegation, right? So prior work has found that perceptions of competence, right, that we trust this person's competent, and congruence or similarity between the requester and the decision maker's goals, right, which would probably be predictive of trust, can predict who people actually delegate to, right? So who are we asking to take this decision? Well, people are typically involving those whom they trust in their decisions. And in fact, we see the same with advice seeking, right? So people seek advice from those whom they trust. And this is one reason why people's reduced willingness to provide help with future decision making after being delegated to is such an important outcome, right? So the people that we delegate to are typically those we trust. And, we really want to take a special care of those relationships.
Professor Mary, can you share an example or case study where strategic delegation of decision making led to positive outcomes for both the manager and the employee?
So in addition to the examples that we've already discussed, employees may react more positively if they view decision-making as a path to promotion or advancement. So as we talked about previously, people see delegation as more fair when it could affect them positively than when it could affect them negatively. And if decision-making is a way for them to prove themselves or establish their managerial chops, so to speak, this can be something that they might welcome or embrace.
Yeah. Professor Hayley and Professor Mary, my last question. What is the key takeaway you would like managers to apply from your research when it comes to delegating decision making in their teams?
I guess the thing that I'd encourage managers to keep in mind is that it's important to weigh the pros and cons when deciding whether to delegate. So delegating may indeed help managers avoid some of the downsides of decision-making, like regret or blame, but it may come at an interpersonal cost if they don't focus on fairness and delegate strategically.
Yeah.
And I'd also add that often delegation isn't the only way to get our team's input. So our research highlights another way to get our colleagues' input without these potential interpersonal costs, and that's asking for advice. So if we want to involve our team members' input, but it may not be a context in which decision delegation is going to seem fair, there is this alternative way that we could involve our colleagues and their ideas and thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Hayley Blunden and Professor Mary Steffel, for sharing your invaluable insights on how to delegate decision-making strategically. Your research has provided us with a deeper understanding of the interpersonal dynamics involved in delegation and how managers can approach it more effectively to support their teams. We are grateful for your time and expertise. To our listeners, we hope you found this conversation insightful and that you will be able to apply some of the strategies in your own work. Thank you once again, Professor Hayley and Professor Mary.